Welcome to the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Since 2010, the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska has worked toward one goal, a food and water secure world. One in which global food security is ensured without compromising the use of water to meet other essential human and environmental needs. It's a daunting vision, but one that is vitally important. This podcast amplifies the voices of those making waves in this space. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
Hello, I'm Frances Hayes, DWFI Director of Communications and Public Relations, and your host for this episode of the Water for Food podcast. Irrigation expansion can provide the water necessary to increase food production for our growing world. It can also be a means for moving farmers from simply producing enough food for their families into generating an income through export of additional crops. However, increasing the use of irrigation can have varying impacts on the nutrition of the local communities. Today, we'll be discussing the trade-offs between nutrition and irrigation sustainability, particularly in the Global South, which can also have major impacts on the livelihood and peace of those in fragile or conflict-affected areas. So I'm joined today by two experts in the field. Piyush Mehta recently finished his PhD in the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences at the University of Delaware. And Dr. Kyle Davis is an assistant professor also in the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences at the University of Delaware. The inspiration for today's podcast came from a recent seminar series titled, Can Water for Food Help Peaceful Outcomes at World Water Week in Stockholm? My colleague, Nicole LaFleur, who runs our Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Irrigation and Mechanization Systems, participated in the session and felt the topic needed some more attention. So she connected me with one of the speakers, Dr. Mark Mueller, group leader and principal investigator at the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology, who then connected me to Piyush and Kyle. So I'm excited to welcome them both and happy to provide an expanded discussion on this topic on our podcast today. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to start off by giving each of you a couple minutes to introduce yourself and summarize your research and expertise.
Sure, yeah. Thanks so much for having us. We're delighted to discuss these topics. These are the things that are really exciting to us. So it's always nice to talk about these things and have a larger platform to spread the word. So I'm Kyle Davis. I'm an assistant professor at University of Delaware, as you said. I'm really interested broadly in questions related to sustainable food systems and thinking about who are the actors and stakeholders involved in defining what sustainability is, thinking about how do you measure sustainability across different dimensions, and using those measures of sustainability to try and evaluate solutions that produce win-wins across a number of outcomes. And I'm particularly interested in the connections between food and water, and a lot of the work that my group does is focused on sustainable irrigation and water sustainability. So thanks so much for having us today.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Francis, for inviting me to this podcast. It's really been an honor. So my name is Piyush Mehta, and I recently finished my PhD in Geography and Spatial Sciences at the University of Delaware, where I had the privilege of working with Dr. Kyle Davis as my advisor, and I also worked with Mark Mueller as a collaborator on the study. So I'll be soon transitioning into a new role of product engineer at Esri, which is a global leader in geographic information system technology. And so my research focuses on the global expansion of irrigation and its implications for both water sustainability and local nutrition. And in my PhD, I led the development of a global irrigated area dataset that mapped irrigation globally, and I also examined the extent of unsustainable irrigation expansion that occurred since the start of the century. So I'm really, all these ideas really interest me to do more research on similar topics. So yeah, I'm really thankful to talk about this project.
Great, thanks, and congratulations on the new gig.
Yeah.
So your research has delved into the role irrigation plays in the nutrition of the local community and the food system there. Can you elaborate on how irrigation might improve nutrition, particularly in regions facing water scarcity or challenging climates?
So irrigation can play a very important role in improving nutrition of the local community. So one of the primary benefits of irrigation is its ability to enhance food production. So when more food is produced, it often leads to a greater food consumption by the local population, which ultimately can translate into improving the overall nutrition of the community. And another pathway can be, so irrigation can allow for cultivation of crops in the regions that would otherwise be unsuitable for agriculture because of limited or no rainfall at all. So in this case, irrigation can enable farmers to grow a variety of crops, including nutritious staples and vegetables that can improve the overall diet quality of the local population consuming it. And finally, through increased food production, irrigation can also lead to an increased farmer incomes. So this can increase the dietary diversity, which is an indicator of nutrition, how well the diet is of the household. And so with increased incomes, farmers are able to buy a variety of foods that was not previously possible for the farmers.
I think a key addition to that is really who are the people or who are the companies or who are the actors in the places where irrigation expansion is happening that are actually benefiting from that irrigation expansion and who actually have access to that improved irrigation infrastructure. And that's kind of the core of what Piyush's work is looking at is there's this underlying assumption that, okay, you expand irrigation in a particular place and it's automatically going to lead to increased food production and nutritional and socioeconomic benefits for farmers in that area. But if it's only a few commercial agricultural enterprises that are really the ones that are able to access those additional irrigation resources, then the benefits aren't being shared equitably in a particular place. So that's really what the work is aimed at getting at.
I think that's a great segue to my next question too, which is to take the other side of the coin there of, are there unintended consequences of irrigation expansion on nutrition? And are there any risks to making smallholder farmers actually more food insecure?
So really good question. So yeah, we also looked at some literature regarding both sides of the coins. What are the positives and what are the negatives? So there are some unintended consequences of irrigation expansion on nutrition. So as I discussed earlier, that irrigation expansion can lead to increased farmer incomes through increased food production. So now this increase in income can also result negatively affecting their diets and nutrition, as farmers might now start consuming more of the processed foods, which are often less nutritious. And as a result, not only might they reduce their intake of nutrient-rich foods, but they may also consume these less nutritious options more frequently. And that will ultimately lead to a decline in overall nutrition. And another pathway could be that irrigation expansion can also result in conversion of subsistence farms to large-scale farms that are often owned by corporations, and they usually focus on cash crop production. So this can make the smallholder farmers more food insecure, as they might lose their ability to grow nutritious crops for their own. And since the large-scale farms primarily are interested in cash crops that are intended for export markets. So as a result of this, farmers might become more reliant on external food sources, making them vulnerable to fluctuations in food availability and prices.
So you're saying that it might affect greatly the types of crops that they grow on their farm, making them lose access then to that diversity of nutrition because they're wanting to sell more high value crops that maybe aren't quite as nutritious, or it's all one thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think there's a whole spectrum of potential scenarios or contexts in which these things play out. It can be in a more subsistence type of situation where farmers are directly consuming what they're producing. It can be more market-based where farmers are selling some of their product and then using that income to purchase things in the market. And then there's these dynamics between smallholder and commercial agriculture with implications for land tenure and displacement that play out in different ways in different places.
So how do you make sure that the strategies that we're using are having the right impact and not a negative long-term nutrition implications for that community? Are there ways to weigh that and figure out how to do that?
Yeah, I think each type of infrastructural investment needs to be tailored to that particular context. I think it's one thing, and it's also just it's one thing to invest in the expansion of the irrigation infrastructure itself, but it's another thing to think about what are the supporting systems, supporting interventions, or supporting types of activities that are going to properly connect smallholder farmers with those irrigation resources. And so I think a lot of these infrastructural development projects potentially require a more holistic view of what it means to develop this type of infrastructure, thinking about what are all of the specific steps in the connections linking a smallholder to these water resources and making sure that those are kind of protected along the way.
Great, thank you. How important is sustainable water management in agriculture to these nutrition outcomes?
Yeah, it's really important. So sustainable water management is really important in agriculture to nutrition outcomes. So first, I would say that it ensures consistent food production. So sustainable water management practices can help maintain a reliable water supply for irrigation, which is essential for a consistent food production for the local population, as well as if the country is a food exporter. So that really helps in maintaining that food production, and also that when farmers can depend on a stable water source, they are better equipped to grow sufficient quantities of food, and also include farming diverse and nutritious crops for both themselves and also for the markets their food is supplying. And sustainable water management also enhances the resilience of crops to climate variability and extremes, because that's happening a lot since the start of the century. And so by implementing practices such as rainwater harvesting, efficient irrigation systems, farmers can better withstand the effects of climate variability and extremes, and also contribute to stable food supplies and consequently result in improved food nutrition for the local communities.
Yeah, you can also imagine that depending on how sustainably water resources are being used, it can tip the scales in terms of equitable access as well. So in groundwater dominated systems, for example, if there's unsustainable water use that's continuing to happen and to draw down groundwater table levels, really it's only going to be the farmers or companies that have the capital to drill larger, deeper boreholes to be able to access that water. And so smallholders can potentially be left out, even if they're able to have borehole wells or source the groundwater.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So to go back to kind of something that you mentioned earlier, Kyle, you were talking about a holistic approach. So how do we effectively integrate irrigation strategies with other agricultural interventions, like drought tolerant crop varieties or soil health management, in order to enhance nutrition and food securities? Are there situations in which you've seen that's worked really well, or what are some success stories in that area?
Irrigation is certainly not a silver bullet, and I think that developing what are kind of referred to as bundles of solutions that can allow flexibility in certain contexts or certain situations is really the way to go. So not putting all of your eggs in the irrigation basket, developing irrigation infrastructure, but also complementing that with other types of interventions. I think that's really the key to getting all of these different co-benefits that you might be trying to achieve. So making sure that you use water more sustainably, making sure that the crops that are being grown are more nutritious, and making sure that farmers are able to increase their incomes at the same time and afford all of the inputs and supporting technologies that are needed for them to be profitable. All of that, I think, needs to be considered together when developing these solutions.
Kind of to build on that too, what are some promising research directions or policy innovations that could further strengthen the link between irrigation, nutrition, and sustainable food systems to make sure that irrigation contributes to a future where everyone has access to safe, nutritious, and affordable food, while we're also managing our planet's water resources well?
So I think that investing in research focused on developing climate resilient agricultural practices and also including advanced irrigation techniques, drought tolerant crop varieties, and innovative soil management strategies is really important. And also understanding how these practices can be effectively integrated into existing systems will be really crucial for enhancing both food security and nutrition in the face of climate change. And secondly, future research should also be prioritized to the integration of nutritional assessments into agricultural planning and irrigation projects. And I've read about this happen in California, which is where I am right now. So they are, since the water is scarce here and droughts keep happening, so the policies have told farmers to focus on fruits and nuts that have high value, and use less water for crops such as maize and other crops. And so I think this involves studying nutritional outcomes of different crops and farming practices to ensure that irrigation expansion actually supports the cultivation of those diverse and nutrient-rich foods.
I can add to that. In terms of research directions, I think what's really needed is kind of a greater integration of these quantitative analyses with more social science and qualitative approaches, because some parts of the water science community are hydrologically focused. They're focused on modeling the hydrological implications of irrigation. And then there's more social science work that's at the level of individual farmers trying to understand how and why they are able to adopt irrigation practices or not, and what all of the specific contextual factors are. And so I think bringing those two research foci into alignment a bit better is a way to really bridge that gap. And I see that as kind of the next wave of research in sustainable irrigation use. And then, yeah, from the policy side, I think in developing these types of infrastructural programs, I think they need to be accompanied by appropriate incentives for farmers or subsidies for farmers to be able to purchase diesel pumps or electric pumps that they would need, and to be able to purchase the types of seeds and crop varieties that would do best in under irrigated agriculture and the conditions that they're in, and also accompanying that with potential changes in policies related to land tenure as well, to better protect smallholder farmers, so that if there's a big irrigation infrastructure project that's being installed in a particular place, that there's not this displacement of smallholders by investments from large-scale commercial farming too. So all of those, I think, are pieces for better ensuring that you realize kind of the nutritional and economic benefits for smallholders from irrigation expansion.
So what I've gathered from your answers is that it's complicated. Everything, as we know, is interconnected, but especially when you're dealing with human behavior and farmers dealing with risk and trying to mitigate that risk while also trying to feed their families while also trying to make an income so they can have good nutrition. So thank you for your research in this area. I think it's really interesting and something that seems, like we're talking about it more and more, which is a good thing, of not just thinking about calories in general, but the right nutrition and how do we ensure that people are being fed in a healthy way. So that is all the questions that I have for you today, but I also want to give you an opportunity to mention anything that we missed or provide any parting words for our audience. So
I would just like to say that just some of the results that we found for this study, that so we looked at we wanted to see the association between irrigation expansion and dietary diversity, which is an indicator for which is a qualitative indicator of the household access to a variety of foods. And it's also a proxy for nutrient adequacy of the diet of individuals. So we since irrigation is marketed as that it can increase food production and also nutrition, but it hasn't been done at a global scale. Most of the studies we found when we were starting this project were from individual countries such as Ethiopia and Kenya, and mostly they were in Africa. So that's why we wanted to fill this gap and wanted to look at this question globally and see how does this association play out on a global context. And so our main result was we found a positive association between irrigation expansion and dietary diversity. And we also found that it has a more positive association where in places where irrigation expanded unsustainably. So in order to explain those results, we looked at how's the crops, what kind of crops are growing in those regions, and are they for export? Are they being used for export or not? So we found that the regions with previous water unsustainability have had a larger proportion of cash crops, and we also found that a higher proportion of export probability for the regions that were already experiencing water stress. So this explains why we are getting a more positive association between irrigation expansion and nutrition. But it's just we found a mix of both the results for sustainable irrigation expansion and unsustainable irrigation expansion.
Yeah, and just to speak to those same points more broadly, I think there are a number of fundamental assumptions that are adopted when thinking about irrigation expansion as a tool for increasing food production, food security. And so I think all of those assumptions need to be evaluated more critically to see which of those connections actually hold. So who's getting access to additional irrigation? Are the crops changing once irrigation becomes available? Is that additional food production actually staying locally or tending to be exported more? All of those things I think are critical questions to actually properly linking irrigation with positive nutritional outcomes in different places.
Yeah, that's very true, and probably very different in different parts of the world, very specific to that area and how things function and the policies and crops grown and all those things. So we will link to your research in our show notes in case people want to take a deeper dive into that. I really appreciate you being guests on the podcast today, Piyush and Kyle. Thanks so much for a fascinating discussion, and I've learned a lot today, so thank you for that, and best of luck in the future research and with your new job, Piyush, and it's great to meet you. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Francis.
Thanks for joining us this time on the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Make sure to visit our website, waterforfood.nebraska.edu, to view show notes or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes.